Chapter 13 is about our trace minerals. Before we get into the individual minerals, one thing that I do want to mention is that minerals are a lot better at regulating their balance in the body, much more so than vitamins are. That's why, if you recall in the previous chapter where we talked about the major minerals, we didn't really have many deficiencies and toxicities to discuss because the body's pretty good at regulating its levels. For example, in the previous chapter we discussed that calcium is something that will be absorbed more readily when you have a need for it, or we have steps to prevent its absorption and release it out of the body if we have too much of it. That's something that we're going to see iron do in a second, and it's something that's going to happen pretty much with all of the minerals. The body will only absorb as much as it needs, and it will really minimize absorption after that. So we're not going to see really too many deficiencies and toxicities for most of these minerals. So let's go ahead and get started with iron. Iron is our first trace mineral, and it is really important because its main role is to be part of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein located inside your red blood cells, and this is what carries oxygen. Oxygen attaches to hemoglobin. Without iron, we wouldn't be able to fully form hemoglobin, which means our red blood cells wouldn't be able to transport oxygen in your blood. Another very important role of iron is that it is part of an oxidation reduction reaction, and this is basically another way of saying an antioxidant reaction or an antioxidant system. So iron is going to play the role of an antioxidant as well, and it also makes the electron carriers in your electron transport chain. So it's important for energy metabolism also. We have two main types of iron in food, and those are heme and non-heme iron. Heme is the iron that is already bound to hemoglobin. So if you remember, we said one of iron's main roles is to help in the formation of hemoglobin, which is located in our red blood cells. So because of that, the place where we're going to find our heme iron is going to be in anything that contains blood cells. So that's going to be our animal products, in particular meat. So you see the red is heme, and it is only located in the meat in this picture. And this is again because the animals that this meat comes from have their own blood supply, which means they contain red blood cells. In those red blood cells, we have iron attached to hemoglobin. So anytime we're referring to heme iron, it's going to have to come from something that contains blood. Now, we're never going to find this in plant foods because obviously plants don't have blood, they don't have their blood supply, they don't have red blood cells, so any iron that is found in plant foods is going to be free iron, or iron that is not bound to hemoglobin, and that is what we call non-heme. So think of heme iron as iron that's attached to hemoglobin, non-heme iron, not hemoglobin, not attached to hemoglobin. Now, besides the difference in where they are found, they also are handled differently in the body. Heme is the one that is actually absorbed a lot more readily, and it is also not affected by the diet. What I mean by that is that it's always going to be absorbed at the same rate, regardless of what else you are eating along with it. Non-heme iron, the one that is found in plants, is not absorbed as well, and it can be influenced by the things that you eat. So the absorption can be decreased or increased based off of what you're eating along with that iron. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different things that can decrease and increase absorption of iron. Remember, this is referring just to the non-heme form because the heme form of iron is not affected by the diet. The absorption rate is always steady. So for the non-heme iron, Certain things that can decrease the absorption are going to be primarily plant foods and grains, especially things that are usually used as replacement for protein, your plant sources of protein. Those are going to be things like, for example, your beans, your legumes. Those are going to decrease the amount of iron that you are able to absorb from your iron source. On the other end of the spectrum, we have things that can increase the amount of iron absorbed. The two main ones are vitamin C and the MFP factor. The MFP factor stands for meat, fish, and poultry. So if those are consumed alongside non-heme iron, you'll be able to absorb the non-heme iron at a higher rate. Another way that you can increase the amount of iron that you consume is by cooking using iron cookware, like an iron skillet. What happens is, as the iron skillet is being exposed to the heat, some of the iron is actually going to loosen up and deposit into the food that you're cooking. I know that sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually completely safe, and it can help if you are low in iron. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens to iron after you consume it. So you eat something that contains iron, and it's going to go ahead and make its way through your system to your intestines where it would normally be absorbed. But if you don't need the iron, you already have enough, it actually is going to be released and not absorbed in order to maintain the balance. So that's one of the ways that iron prevents toxicity. Now, if you do need it, it's going to be stored in your body using a storage protein called ferritin. Ferritin is the way that we store iron in the body. Once iron is ready to be used, ferritin will release the iron and attach it to a new protein called transferrin. And transferrin is going to transport iron to wherever it needs to go. So again, we consume iron from food. If we don't need it, it's not going to be absorbed, it'll just leave the body. If we do need it, we're going to go ahead and absorb it and store it as ferritin, so that when we do need it, we can just release it from the ferritin stores and attach it to a transport protein called transferrin, which will take it to where it needs to go. Another few terms that I want you to know, we have a hormone that is also going to help us regulate the amount of iron that we absorb, and that hormone is called hepcidin. Hepcidin is going to decrease the amount your body absorbs if you already have too much. We also have another new term here, the term hemosidrin. We said that iron is usually stored as ferritin, but if you have too much iron, the body will go ahead and store some of that excess iron in a different storage form called hemosidrin. The reason it does this is because hemosidrin actually releases its iron stores very slowly. And that's something that we want if we already have too much iron. We want to try and keep it in storage for as long as possible. And hemosidrin can release the iron at a much slower rate. So let's go ahead and take a look at what can happen in our body when we are trying to recycle iron that has already been used. Now, what I mean by that in particular is what part of the iron in our body is going to be located in the red blood cells. Remember, we said it's part of hemoglobin. Now, red blood cells don't live forever. They die off usually after 3 or 4 months long, and then our body makes new red blood cells. But instead of our body just getting rid of the whole red blood cell, what will usually happen is the red blood cell will break open and release the iron so that the iron can be reabsorbed, and then it can go ahead and make its way to the liver, where the liver can package it into transferrin if it wants to be transported, or else it can store it away for later use. Deficiencies of iron are actually pretty common. Even though we said that the body's pretty good at absorbing more or less depending on our needs, some people have really high needs or really low intakes because of their diet or their current stage of life. For example, women who are pregnant need so much iron that they're not even able to get enough if they just consume it through food. They need to take it through supplement form. Also, young children need a lot of iron since they're growing. Also, if a woman is in her reproductive years and is getting her menstrual cycle on a regular basis, then each month she is losing a large amount of iron. One of the easiest ways to lose iron is through blood loss, because remember, iron is part of your red blood cells. That's where a lot of it is located. So with a woman who is going through her menstrual cycle, each month she's losing a good amount of iron. We also have vegetarians and vegans. And the reason for this is because they will have what we talked about before as the less absorbable form of iron, which was non-heme. The only way that they can get the iron that's more readily absorbed is to eat meat. So if a person is vegan or vegetarian, they're only going to get the type that is not absorbed very well. And then to top it off, we said that when you eat non-heme iron with plant protein, it decreases the absorption even more. And that's something that a lot of vegans and vegetarians consume. They swap out protein from meat sources for protein in the form of plants, like your grains, your beans, your legumes. And so they're already getting the type of iron that's not absorbed very well. And then to top it off, they're decreasing the absorption even more because of what they're consuming in their diet. So vegans and vegetarians often need to take an iron supplement as well. Now, when we have an iron deficiency, the main way that it is going to be presented is through anemia. That is one of the things that iron deficiency is most commonly associated with, because of the fact that it plays such a big role in the formation of our red blood cells. If we don't have enough iron, we're not going to be able to form enough hemoglobin. Without enough hemoglobin, we're not going to have a lot of oxygen in our blood being delivered to our body. So this over here shows us the anemia that we can get from iron deficiency. So this is similar to what we saw before when we looked at folate deficiency and B12 deficiency anemia, but this anemia is a little different. So we already know how a regular red blood cell develops correctly in a healthy state. That's what we see on the left side. But then when someone has an iron deficiency, what happens is when the cell splits apart and normally would begin synthesizing and intensifying hemoglobin, it doesn't have much hemoglobin to work with because we don't have iron to complete the hemoglobin. And so you end up with these really small, pale cells, since hemoglobin is what gives it its color. And without much hemoglobin in there, the red blood cells are not going to be carrying enough oxygen. Other things that can happen in a deficiency are trouble concentrating, trouble with critical thinking, and then as well fatigue. But those are things that are usually hard to associate with iron because people tend to think, well, I've just been really busy, I haven't had a good night's sleep, or some other reason where they might get their fatigue from, when in actuality it could be an iron deficiency. Another thing that can happen when a person is deficient in iron is something called pica. Pica is something that is seen in pregnant women who are deficient in iron. It is a condition where these women start to crave non-edible things. So they want to eat things like soil, dirt, clay, cotton. And it's something that is really odd. They're not exactly sure why it happens yet, They think it's because their body is so deficient for iron that it starts craving things that are rich in iron, like the soil, for example. But not all of those things that these pregnant women start to crave are high in iron. And so they're not really quite sure about that theory, but they have seen that it is a common pattern that pregnant women who are deficient in iron start to crave those non-edible items. Iron toxicity is something that's not very common because we have hepcidin to decrease the absorption if we have too much iron, and we have hemosiderin as an alternative way to store iron away. But some people have a genetic condition called hemochromatosis, where their body basically is not able to regulate any excess iron that enters the body. These individuals need to eat less iron in the first place, and then they also usually have to come in for chelation therapy every now and then. Chelation therapy is when they put something called chelates into your body. Chelates will latch onto iron and then leave the body. So basically it's forcing the excess iron to leave the individual's body. Now, the reason it's so important to deal with iron toxicity if it does develop is because it can start causing some really big health issues. And the main reason it does this is because, remember, we said one of iron's roles is to act as an antioxidant. And one thing that we mentioned before is that when you have too much of an antioxidant, it actually starts acting like a pro-oxidant. A pro-oxidant stimulates free radical production. So conditions that you could develop from free radical damage start to show up in these individuals because all of that extra iron is now stimulating free radical production instead of protecting you from it. And that could include things like heart disease or even cancer. The next mineral is zinc, and zinc has lots and lots of different roles. One of the things that it's commonly known for is for your immune function. There are zinc lozenges that you can buy from a pharmacy that are promoted to help when you're ill. Also, it's something that is really important when an individual is going through a big growth period in their life, like children, adolescents. It's also really important for your taste and your visual senses, as well as healthy sperm production. Zinc is very similar to iron in the sense that it has storage proteins and transport proteins to help it once it enters the body. The transport proteins that zinc uses are albumin and transferrin, which again is just like iron. Iron also uses transferrin to be transported throughout the body. Now the issue with this is if iron and zinc use the same transporter, we want to make sure that we don't have too much iron or too much zinc, because then they'll just occupy all of the transporters and there won't be room for the other mineral to get transported through the body. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. We get zinc from the food that we eat, and just like iron, if we have excess, we can go ahead and put it into a storage protein, but it's a different storage protein here called metallothionein. And if we don't need zinc, if we already have too much, we can go ahead and just release it out of the body instead of absorbing it. Now, if we did need the zinc, it's then going to be released from storage to one of its transporters. This can be albumin or transferrin, and then that can go ahead and send the zinc to wherever it's needed in the body. Now, after that, what can also happen is it can make its way to the pancreas. And the reason that it can go to the pancreas is because the pancreas is where zinc plays a really important role in the digestion process. If you remember, we said that the pancreas makes digestive enzymes, digestive juices, and it actually needs zinc to do that. And so one thing that can happen is Albumin and transferrin will go ahead and send the zinc to the pancreas. The pancreas will use zinc to make the enzymes, and then it will go ahead and send the enzymes to the intestines, because remember, the pancreas delivers enzymes to the small intestine, and then all of the nutrients complete their digestion there. But what can happen is, after those enzymes do their job and digest all of our nutrients, the zinc that was part of the digestive enzymes can also be absorbed into the cells of the small intestine. And that way it can enter into our bloodstream again. It can be absorbed into the cells of the intestines and then picked up by the bloodstream and either stored away or transported somewhere else so that it can function over again. So basically, this is another way where we can recycle zinc. It can be used to make digestive enzymes in the pancreas and then reabsorbed into the intestines and delivered throughout the body again. When it comes to zinc deficiencies, this is something that can delay growth permanently if it happens to a child during their growth spurts. It can also make the immune system not function as properly, more prone to getting sick, getting infections, and it can also affect the brain function as well. This over here is showing us an example of dwarfism that formed due to a zinc deficiency. So you see a full-grown man on the right-hand side, and then you have what looks to be a boy of the same ethnicity. But this is actually an 18-year-old boy that looks like a 7-year-old boy. And the reason for this is because at the age of 7, this person was deficient in zinc and remained deficient in zinc until they passed their growth period. So when we go through our childhood, we have the ability to grow until we reach the point where our height, our physical features stop growing. If the child does not correct the zinc deficiency before this period is over, then the growth will be permanently stunted, like you see in this picture. If the zinc deficiency is corrected while the child is still young enough to grow, then their growth can pick up again. But again, it needs to be done at the correct time before it's too late, or the growth delay will be permanent. Toxicity, on the other end, is not very common. If it does happen, it will usually be through supplement form. But if we do have too much zinc, one of the things that it can affect is the ability for our body to use copper. And that's because it also shares a protein with copper, which we'll look at in a second. So the next mineral is iodine, and iodine is a really important mineral because it helps our body make thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are not able to be formed without iodine. And thyroid hormones have a lot of important roles. They help regulate our temperature, our metabolism, reproduction, growth. It's very important basically for all functions of your body. Now, the place that we're going to find our iodine from is going to be primarily seafood and sea vegetables. Now, years and years ago, people had to eat more locally sourced foods. We didn't have the luxury of having foods that have been delivered from different parts of the country, from different countries as well, like we do these days. And so if somebody didn't live next to a body of water, they weren't able to consume seaweed or seafood very often. And because of that, a lot of people were starting to be deficient in iodine. So the government decided to do something about that and put iodine in something that is not going to spoil, something that can last a long time, delivered easily, and that people consume pretty regularly. And that was salt. So when you see a container of salt that says iodized salt on it, that is salt that has iodine added to it. And ever since they did that, the amount of iodine deficiencies have really gone down. Now, if there is a deficiency, the main thing that you're going to see is, like you do in this picture, this big lump in the throat, which we call a goiter. And I'll show you how this develops in a second, but before I get into that, I want to mention that pregnant women tend to have deficiencies in iron as well because the needs are higher. And if a woman does not correct the iodine deficiency, her baby can be born hypothyroid, where the thyroid doesn't function as well, or the baby can be born with a form of dwarfism that we call cretinism. This is not just physical dwarfism, but it affects the brain, the ability to think properly. The child will end up having behavioral issues and issues with learning as well. Now this over here is showing us how a goiter develops. So we start off with your thyroid gland on the left. That is the normal size of a thyroid gland. And normally what happens is, as the bloodstream passes by the thyroid gland, the thyroid picks up iodine, and then it uses that iodine to make your thyroid hormones. Now, if you weren't getting enough iodine, the thyroid gland is going to try to compensate for that by enlarging itself to a really large size so that when the bloodstream comes by, it can pick up every little bit of iodine that's in the bloodstream. It's basically trying to be more efficient at picking up the iodine since there's not much iodine to pick up in the first place. And that's why a goiter will develop. Toxicities of iron are less common. Usually if there is a toxicity, it's due to taking a lot of supplements. But when it comes to a toxicity, things can go in two different directions. One of the things that can happen is you can actually develop a goiter by having too much iodine. So a goiter is usually due to not enough iodine, but sometimes having too much iodine will also enlarge the thyroid gland because the thyroid gland is trying to keep up with all of the iodine that's coming its way. Another thing that will happen is either hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. Hypothyroid is usually what comes with deficiencies because the thyroid isn't able to function properly. It's functioning at a lower rate since you don't have enough iodine to make the hormones. But if you have too much iodine, then the thyroid gland will either start working overtime and you will have too many thyroid hormones, which is the hyperthyroid, or your thyroid gland will basically slow down its function or completely shut down because it feels like it's getting too much iodine that it doesn't need. It doesn't need to keep making hormones, and so it will start to slow down and eventually shut down. So it can actually go both ways. The next mineral is selenium, and selenium also has some relation to the thyroid gland. So we said that the thyroid gland makes thyroid hormones, but one thing that I didn't mention is that those thyroid hormones also need to be activated. What happens is when our body activates the thyroid hormones, it naturally also produces free radicals. And selenium is part of an antioxidant system called glutathione peroxidase that protects us against those free radicals in particular. So it's part of this really specialized antioxidant system that fights the free radicals that are made when we activate thyroid hormones. Another role for selenium is substituting for sulfur. So we said that sulfur can be used to make disulfide bridges in different proteins. If sulfur is not available to make those disulfide bridges, we can also make them using selenium. Now I just want to mention one source for selenium because it is such a great source that is often overlooked, and that is Brazil nuts. Brazil nuts have so much selenium that if you just eat 1 or 2 a day, you already have met your recommendation. The next mineral is copper, and copper relates to some of the minerals that we've already discussed. I had mentioned that copper also uses the same protein as zinc, and that was referring to the albumin protein. Copper gets transported by albumin just like zinc does. It also relates to iron because it helps iron bind to transferrin. Remember, iron needs to be transported using the transport protein transferrin, but without copper, it's not able to do that. So it normally wouldn't be able to leave its storage to go to where it's needed if copper wasn't available. So that's a really important role, helping iron be transported throughout the body. But it also is going to be part of an antioxidant system in our body as well to help us fight free radicals. Deficiency and toxicity are not very common. The deficiency presents itself through heart disease, but again, not very common. Toxicity is only going to be something that is going to happen either through really excessive supplement intake, or if somebody has one of these genetic conditions that prevents the body from regulating its copper balance. One of the roles of manganese is to help with the formation of our bones, but the most important role is that it helps to convert pyruvate to oxaloacetate. You see here that it says it converts it to a TCA cycle compound. That compound is oxaloacetate, which, if you recall, is needed in order for acetyl-CoA to be able to enter the cycle. We already discussed one nutrient that helps convert pyruvate to oxaloacetate, and that was the vitamin biotin. So if I were to ask which vitamin converts pyruvate to oxaloacetate, it would be biotin. Which mineral helps to convert pyruvate to oxaloacetate? It would be manganese. Deficiencies and toxicities are also pretty rare for manganese. Toxicity is something that would happen if somebody was working in a mine for a prolonged period of time and inhaled a lot of their environment. Then they could possibly get a toxicity, but again, not very common.
Chromium is a more newly discovered mineral, so we don't know too much about it as of now. So the only thing that I really want you to know for this mineral is the main role that we are aware of, and that role is that it helps insulin do its job. So we know that insulin is what helps us put away our excess blood sugar to make sure our blood sugar drops to a normal level. And chromium is going to help insulin be more effective in putting away our excess blood sugar.
The last mineral that we're going to discuss is fluoride, which I'm sure you've seen in dental products like toothpaste and mouthwash. And that is because it is really good at preventing tooth decay. And this is because it actually converts that hard crystallized structure, hydroxyapatite, into fluoroapatite. And fluoroapatite is something that is even harder to penetrate. It makes the bones and teeth even stronger than they were as hydroxyapatite. Now, one of the places we can get it is from our dental products, but in the US we actually add fluoride to the drinking water as well. So the water that you get even from your faucet contains fluoride in it also. Now, some countries don't add fluoride into their water, and the reason for that is because they're concerned about a fluoride toxicity, which is called fluorosis. And that's what you're seeing in this picture over here. It is possible to get too much fluoride, and what happens is you start seeing this discoloration and indentations in the teeth.